So I understand that the Paul is totally is not God's apostles, and the 4 books of gospel they are just supporting what's Paul mentioned before, right? And it's
No,
keep on
I don't
developing,
know.
right?
I don't know that the 4 Gospels are supporting Paul at all. I don't believe that. I think it's a mistake to think Matthew. We don't know who wrote Matthew. You understand that? Matthew does not identify himself as Matthew. The book does not claim to be an eyewitness or written by an apostle. Doesn't make that claim. No manuscript has Matthew in it. Okay? That's going to be a much later invention. But Matthew, we know, is not writing based on eyewitness account. He is writing, first of all, he copied Mark, almost all of Mark. Well, if he's really Matthew, what did he need Mark for? Mark wasn't even a disciple. You understand how problematic this is? Stop for a moment. What I'm telling you right now, all Christian scholars know. The Christian in the church doesn't know this. But if Matthew really is a disciple, is the tax collector, why would he have to be borrowing everything from Mark? And then, 200 verses that we find in both Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. Okay? We find more than 200 verses that we find in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Which means those two, who are very far away from each other, they're not talking to each other. We know that because they disagree on so many other things. Have another source that they're copying from. Right? And we actually call that the source, or Q, for the German word. Yeah. So these are not, they're not copying Paul. There are oral traditions all over, and then in different communities, they grow differently, develop differently. Just as you can be in Indonesia with thousands of islands, and you have development of ideas and outlooks in different cultures in this one country, because people live apart. So ideas develop and develop very differently, to the point that when they had the elections in Indonesia, the president, different islands voted very differently, because their worldview had developed very differently. And this is the same country, the same region of the world. And this is nothing, this is just politics. So therefore, all of them are borrowing all kinds of traditions. Matthew has, now there are some information, some things only in Matthew that nowhere else. Like for instance, the parable of the sheep and the goats. You know that parable?
Yeah.
Parable of the sheep and goats. What is the parable about?
The sheep is representing the good people.
They're the good people, and what did they do?
Is,
they were just good to other people, right? Yeah. And what happens to them? They'll be in heaven. Yeah. And what are the goats? The goats are people who, what did they do? They didn't do good things. Yeah. Paul would not agree with that story, am I right? If I told Paul, if I asked Paul, let me ask you, if I'm a good person and I'm good to people, and if I'm a bad person, I go to hell, what would Paul say?
If you believe in Jesus, then you go to hell.
Right. And Jesus, actually, in the parable, people say, but Jesus, I was good to you. And he said, but you didn't treat other people nicely. Am I right or wrong? I know my parables. Do you understand? That means, so we see it, is Matthew really the person who compiles the book of Matthew, is he really asking Paul for advice? No. Because that parable would have never snuck in. And believe me, whoever made up that, wherever that came from, it's a tradition, just like the adulterous woman who stoned. Someone made it up, and that's very late. But if you put in the same room Paul and the person who made up that parable, only one of them would come out alive. You understand? So, no, the author of Matthew is not, the author of Matthew and all of the sources are not Paul. They're all very, very differently, with obviously some very And their differences are much more striking than what they have in common. Of course, there are very important things in common to the Christian. But no, they're not relying on Paul. They have very different development all over. I mean, in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, you have to keep the law. Whoever doesn't keep it, you think Paul would say such a thing? And when you find in Luke wrote the book of Acts. We don't know who wrote Luke. We only know whoever wrote Luke wrote Acts. Okay? We call him Luke because it's convenient. Okay? But whoever wrote it, right? So the idea that Paul was in trouble and he was called down by the Jerusalem to show that he'll circumcise Timothy. Well, does Paul mention that in his own writings? Timothy? Is it anywhere? No. Why not? That's not the kind of thing Paul would want to tell people. You see? So rather than there's a history and then people write about it in the Gospels, no. What happens is there's an idea. This is what we would like our Jesus to do. This is what we'd like to think about. And then we write the story as though it happened. So that's what's happening to people. People are reading stories that are very rich in prose, in powerful instruments. There's a villain, a bad guy, a good guy, everything we'd want to see in a great movie. Well-developed characters, very gripping. It just is a movie, that's all, just naturally.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא לעת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא